All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Thursday, the last day of the week. Because if you missed it earlier, we have a Pro D, a professional development day tomorrow, or at least I do. So I'm gonna go get professionally developed, and you all get the day off, which hardly seems fair, but I guess that's how it is, right? Let's see. Let's see who's here. Shania's here. Good morning. Good morning, Shania. Blake is here. Good morning, Blake. Sarah's here. Good morning, Sarah. Simrat is here. Good morning, Simrat. Ryan is here. Good morning, Ryan. And Abby's here. Good morning, Abby. Okay, so yesterday, what we were doing is we were looking at this article on, oops, I'm just going to jump ahead a few slides here. A couple more slides, maybe. There. We were reading this article about race and gender oppression in the classroom. And again, we read it for a couple reasons. Number one, because it's on topic, right? We are talking about racism. It's a context that we're familiar with because we've all been in classrooms. And it's also an academic article. And it's probably an academic article that's more, it's at a fairly easy to understand level. Some of them get very kind of wordy, and the writers like to use fancy, complicated language, and they're difficult to read. But this one is reasonably straightforward to read. And so we kind of walked through this article in order to sort of show you the parts of an article. This is mostly how they're written. They're all written the same. It doesn't matter what sort of subject discipline you go into, if it's science or social science or even math or whatever it is. Academic papers are going to be, good morning, are going to be written in the same way, right? So again, if you understand that, you're halfway there, right? Because you know what to expect going in. And again, if you're short for time, you can reasonably confidently skip over some parts of it and sort of get to the good stuff. Obviously, if you're taking a methods course, don't skip over the methodology. If you're taking a theory course, don't skip over the theoretical framework. But, good morning. But if you're a first year or even a second year student, you probably won't be doing those things. It'll probably be overview classes. And so, yeah, you can kind of just skip over that middle part and get to the good stuff, and that will be good enough for your prof, because that's what they want you to do. They want you to know the outcome of the experiment or the argument the person is making, not every single detail in the paper. So that said, we dug into this article yesterday and we read through it. And can you remind me what Shavella Pittman's argument was?
Female professor's color was questioned by discrimination by the white male students.
Yeah. The fancy term Shavella Pittman was using was gendered racism, right? So yeah, these women of color who were faculty at this university were experiencing gendered racism in the classroom, pretty much exclusively from white male students, right? And again, what were her kind of premises? What's her supporting evidence for that?
She interviewed the professors by questioning them.
Yeah.
How was the day in class?
Yeah. She just sort of sat these professors down and said, "Hey, what's your experience in class? What's it like?" Right? And these are the patterns that came out, right? And so how were these women experiencing gendered racism in the classroom?
When she made a mistake and then a student emailed her.
Mm-hmm. Right, and what was that kind of an example of? Because she had a few categories of issues, right? I think Shavella Pittman had four kind of headings in her article, because the experiences fell under kind of four general patterns. So that one was, which one? Say again? Yeah, so some students were using their first name, whereas they were using doctor with other students, right? We have the questioning of, well, for yours, it was questioning their teaching competency, right? That's what it was. And so there were questions about, there was that mistake that the professor made. There was questions about whether, they were, being too hard on them, or were they offering the right assignments, or did they grade it right? There were ideas about that. Daniel, your thing about the name is a thing of authority, right? And so not respecting the professor's authority in the classroom. And so some of those female professors mentioned that they have to, they can't be too friendly, right? Because if they're too friendly, they won't be taken as an authority figure. And so they have to kind of carefully balance being the boss with being kind of friendly enough to be accepted. Do you think that's something that male professors think about? No? Why not?
Because maybe the students think male professors are tough, and if you comment on the teaching or something, they'll be rude to you.
Well, maybe, right? So maybe they already perceive these male professors to be tough. That could be the case, yeah.
Or maybe they think that you can disturb a female since she's weak and she'll not damage you anything, something like that.
Yeah, and what you're describing there is kind of textbook internalized dominance, right? It's the sort of subconscious feeling that oh, I can challenge this professor, or I can say my snarky comment to them, and they won't do anything, right? And again, it's a subconscious thing. It's not, people are probably not thinking these things consciously, but they kind of have the impression that, oh, this prof won't say anything, so I can just openly challenge them, right?
What was the argument?
What was the argument again?
Female professors of color are facing discrimination, gender racism by the white male students.
Mm-hmm. That's a long one, I know. Right, so yeah, and part of it comes down to, I wanted to point this out, here in the West, again, I can't speak to all of your experiences because you're from different countries and different places, but here in the West, when we think of a college professor, a university professor, who do we picture?
A male?
Yeah, a male. What else about him?
Old.
An old guy?
Especially for math.
Especially for math. Math teachers are older than the average? Interesting. I'm not telling Mr. Keith that, by the way. He's
No,
not.
I meant for college.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Mr. Keith.
Because in college they have those big sums, like the body is full, so you have those old teachers.
Yeah. Yeah, so you've got old teachers. Here in the West, we often think of them to be white, right? Old, male, white teachers. And I think also part of the kind of stereotype is they're a little bit odd, right? They're a little bit quirky, a little bit weird. College professors often are a little, and again, I've met a lot of college professors. They're some of them are a little strange in various ways. Yeah, maybe serious. Yeah, so this is the thing, right? Is that this is the thing, is that it's the same thing as, when the lenses come down. Remember we talked about the resumes being sent out, and the resumes with the sort of stereotypically black names get seen through the lens of those stereotypes. Here, the same thing is happening for these women of color, right? So the stereotype, the person we expect when we sit in a college classroom is the white male professor who's old and a little bit weird, right? And in walks this, young black woman or young Asian woman, right? And so it challenges people's stereotypes, right? It challenges what they what they expect, right? And all of a sudden, she's going to be judged differently, right? Because the white male professor who comes in the room, who's old and a little bit weird, he doesn't challenge anyone's stereotypes, right? People see what they expect to see, and they're like, oh, okay, here's the prof, and then they go about their class. But because that stereotype exists, because that's the norm, because that's the default, when we see someone different, we're like, oh, okay, that's weird. And then you start seeing them through the eyes of stereotypes, right? Stereotypes about women, stereotypes about people of color, stereotypes about what kind of scholarship is legitimate and what kind of scholarships is not legitimate. Sorry, I just got to type something in here. Right. What's another category of gendered racism that these women are experiencing? So they challenge their teaching competency, challenge their authority in the classroom. What else? Two more. We just said that. Right. The last one, the fourth one was threatening and intimidation. And how did these women feel that they were threatened by these white male students? How did they feel threatened? By what?
The student sent.
Sorry, say that one more time.
By the email the student sent.
Okay, what was the email?
Correcting one mistake.
Oh, yeah, that wasn't the threatening part, though. That wasn't the threatening part. Yeah, she didn't enjoy that email very much, but I don't think she was threatened by it. Oh yeah. What happened in that case with that white supremacist student? What did they say? Right. So this guy in one of her classes, surprising that he was actually taking this class given his views, but he said something to the effect of that black people were only a small percentage of the United States, and if they wanted control or they wanted their share, they were going to have to fight for it because nobody was going to take our country from us and that kind of thing. And that's pretty shocking because that's not even a microaggression, right? That's basically a racist statement right there, and probably spoken to a person of color, no less, right? So, some of the things that I think are happening in this article are mostly internalized dominance, right? It's people acting out their prejudice and not really understanding what they're doing, I think. I don't know. But this is a pretty clear example of, something that is outright offensive. And it's interesting that this guy felt that he could sort of stand up in class and say this openly. But anyway, so that's part of it. What else is there in the threatening category? What does it say here? Several women faculty of color talked about low course evaluation ratings from race and gender privileged students and express their fear of how these might affect their departmental reviews. Yeah, so at the end of every class in university, and sometimes here too, there's a course evaluation, right, where students can say, hey, I thought this class was good, hey, I thought this class was not great, and here's why. You always have these things, and unfortunately, the pattern seems to be that women professors and people of color tend to score statistically lower than white male professors. And I think it has to do with that expectation, right? That lens that we see other people through, right? But let's go a little further. Alice shared a threatening interaction in which a white male student threw papers at her, right? So again, that's not good behavior, right? You don't throw things at people, right? They teach you that in kindergarten, don't they, when you're about 5 years old? Don't throw things at people, unless it's like a baseball and you're playing catch, but clearly not. Yeah, don't throw things at people, right? But here, it seems that this student thought that was okay, right? And again, it's tough to know, but you have to ask the question, would he have thrown those papers at a male professor, right? Would he have behaved the same way? Or did her gender have anything to do with it? Or did her race have anything to do with it? Or did both things have something to do with it at the same time, right? Let's see. Okay, what's the last one? Threats and intimidation, scholarly expertise is the last one. I just said it, damn it. What did that have to do with it? White male students challenging their scholarly expertise. This is probably the trickiest one, actually. Yeah, what about it? What's an example of it? An example of a student challenging scholarly expertise. Yeah, but pull something from the article here.
Scholars are supposed to do studies, right? Like research and things.
Yep.
So they challenge what the professor thinks.
Yeah, I want a little more than that, though. They are challenging what the professor thinks, which to some degree is okay, right? Because that's not what's happening in this article, but I should point out that, that's what academics do, right? They challenge each other all the time. That's how knowledge moves forward, right? Shavella Pittman writes an article like this, and her colleagues critique it, right? The academic community says, yeah, Shavella, I think you're on the right track here, or I think you've said some good things, but I think you were wrong about this, and they kind of argue it out, right? That's how things move forward. So challenging ideas is okay, but what's going on in the context of this particular situation here? Because there's a difference.
The white males will open the door without knocking, the office door without knocking.
Yeah, that's an authority thing, I think. That's under the authority category. Yeah, there was the whole, it was I don't know what the course is. It sounds like it's some sort of, maybe like a communication or media studies course, maybe, some kind of thing. And it seems like a lot of the material from the course was media or stories that came from minoritized groups, right? So whether it's film or novels or short stories or whatever, those stories were kind of from the perspective of minoritized groups. And then finally at the end she shows Blade Runner, which, as they mention, is very masculine, very white, very violent, and we've seen Blade Runner come up in one of our video essays, right? And so the impression she got from this student was like, oh, now we're doing something worthwhile, right? Now we're looking at material that is actually legitimate or actually, worth looking at. And so the professor kind of felt like, oh, none of that other stuff was kind of real, right? And now something that kind of reflects what the student already knows, suddenly that's the real scholarship, right? That's the legitimate stuff, right? And so again, this is a tricky one because again, you are supposed to challenge people in academia, but again, this isn't really what this student was doing, right? They weren't academically challenging, work that the professor had done. They were challenging the fact about what is worth looking at and what's not worth looking at, right? And it had to do with whether that reflected his this white student's reality, if you will. All right. Let me just see where we are here. I think I'm going to leave those last two questions, and I think I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit here. Yeah. So, question for you. Why are these white male students acting the way that they are? What were they taught, do you think?
That women are weak, you can believe them.
Okay, that women are weaker and you can push them around, you can bully them, right? Do you think they were taught that consciously or unconsciously? Maybe unconscious. Hopefully unconsciously. Hopefully they weren't taught that directly, but it's true, right? Why else do you think these students are acting in this way?
Because she's a black lady.
Okay.
She's from a different race.
Okay. So the status of these are women of color makes a difference, and how does that make a difference, would you say?
Because she's from the other group, they are the dominant, and then she's from the other.
Okay, so she's a minoritized group member, and what does that mean? Yeah, they seem to unconsciously feel that they are superior. What's that?
Like the bosses of the race.
Yeah, that they have, they can sense the kind of social power that they have, right? This is a situation where, there's a pretty clear power dynamic, right? You're in a university classroom. The university has given authority to the prof, right? The prof's in charge. That's how university classrooms work. This person is an authority in their field, right? They have a PhD and years of research experience. They know about their subject matter, whatever it is, and yet these students feel that like, oh, well, I'm just as smart and qualified as you, and I'm going to stand up here and, I'm going to teach you something, kind of thing. And it's like, no, you're not, right? These women are experts in their fields, right? They've forgotten more about their subject than you will probably ever know, and so, there's. It's kind of an unrealistic challenge because, again, if you know your stuff and you've done your research, then yeah, you can challenge people. But if you don't know anything, which first-year students often don't, it's pretty hard to challenge the prof, right? Because you don't know what they know. I used to have a friend who in university he'd have to write papers, and I'd check in with him, like the night before it was due, and he hadn't started it yet. I was like, "You haven't started your paper? It's due tomorrow. Like, what are you doing?" And he's like, "Oh, I'll just BS it. I'll just make it sound good." And I was like, but you can't, right? Like, this is all that these, like, your instructor, your professor, this is all they think about, right? I took a lot of anthropology courses. Anthropology is like all these people think about. You're not going to fool them, right? You're not going to write something that, ooh, this guy knows what he's thinking. They know, right? They know from like the first word whether you get it or not. Like, you cannot fool them that way. They're experts, right? But anyway, he thought that he could. But I guess he graduated with his degree, so maybe he did fool them, or maybe they just passed him to like get him out of their class. I don't know. Okay, but as you can see here, people are acting this way because they are taught to, right? This is internalized dominance. And if you look at white people, particularly white males, they receive a lot of information in society that shows them that they are the most important thing, that their perspectives and the way they see the world and the things they think are important are actually the way things are, and are actually the most important things. It's kind of not surprising that sometimes you see people act this way. I mean, just look at some media here. So these are popular, are there any movies? No, these are all popular television shows, right? You can find most or all of these on Netflix. Some of them are a couple years old here, but almost all of them are stories of white people, for the most part. The Simpsons are yellow, but they're supposed to be white, of course. But almost all of these are the stories of white people. And yes, there are non-white characters in basically all of these shows, almost all of these shows, but the story centers around a white family or white people's experience, right? Almost all of them do. Yeah, Friends is a perfect example, right? A very undiverse cast. And again, it was the 90s, right? People weren't talking about diversity in the 90s. But there's lots and lots of shows that show one particular experience, one particular worldview at the expense of basically everybody else, right? I know this is an old comic book kind of thing, but if you look at the Justice League is entirely white, except for like Martian Manhunter, who's green. Like, they have a green guy before they've managed to get a black guy in the Justice League, right? They have representation from Mars or wherever the heck he comes from. Does he? Interesting. But still, what's his backstory? Is he a human or is he some sort of alien? What? He is Martian? Okay. Sorry, I don't know the DC universe quite as well as the Marvel one. But still, this is an entirely white, with the exception of him, this is an entirely white universe, right? Heroes, and what's the message here? Heroes are white, right? Well, I mean, I know it sounds kind of trite to reduce it to that, but why can Latinos not be a hero? Why can black people not be a hero? Why are there no Chinese people here? Can Chinese people not be heroes? I don't know, but the Justice League seems to imply that only white people are heroes, right? If you look at religion, if you look at Western religion anyway, you'll know who this is, right? And so here, Jesus, the Son of God, and God himself, do you ever see God portrayed in human form? Well, this is kind of Jesus, but I mean his Father. Not so often, right? Not so often. But here we have a very recognizable image of Jesus Christ, kind of the head of the focus of Christian or Catholic religion. But he's portrayed as a white guy, right? A couple of years ago, or a number of years ago, some scientists got together and tried to sort of construct a picture of what would Jesus actually have looked like, maybe. Because Jesus was not a white man, right? Jesus was a Jewish person, right? A Palestinian. And a Palestinian living, 2,000 years ago. And so rather than something like this, which is very common to see, the researchers suggested that, the real Jesus probably would have looked probably a little more something like this. Obviously, it's not exact. We don't have skeletal remains from Jesus Christ, so you can't really do this sort of thing. But based on, what people probably looked like 2,000 years ago in that part of the world, this is a much more realistic picture of what this man would have looked like. He's not a white man, right? He's not a white man. He's a person of color, right? He's a Middle Eastern person, right? And so, again, it's interesting that, most of the world portrays him this way when, in real life, he probably would have looked a little bit closer to something like this. But it's probably no surprise because, again, if you look at art, if you look at religious art through the years, you will often see biblical characters, saints, and Jesus himself portrayed as white people. And of course, maybe that's not surprising because the art was created by white people for white people. And so here you have a pretty classic Adam and Eve, the sort of classic story from the Old Testament. And again, they are portrayed as white, right? The first people, right? The people that God creates in his own image, they're white people, right? Which is interesting because science and evolution would tell you a totally different story. The first humans were probably unquestionably black. They evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago. And again, this kind of white skin tone that I'm rocking today, that's a very recent genetic mutation. That's not the original. This is not the original color that humans come in. The original color that humans come in is quite a few shades darker than me. And it has to do, again, with where they come from in the world and sort of how close to the equator they are. So here we have a religious representation, a cultural representation of the first people being white, but scientifically speaking, the first people were almost certainly very dark-skinned. So all of these are kind of, these are implicit messages, right? These are social messages that circulate under the surface, and they tell us that it's better to be white. They tell us that the white way of looking at things, the white experience, white values, those are the normal values, right? Those are the good values. Those are the values that everybody has, or at least should have, right? And people who challenge or oppose them, well, they're wrong, right? That's the kind of message that you get from this. And it's a partly racist message. It's an ethnocentric message. And again, it's one that many people in the West kind of carry without really realizing it. And again, it's because all parts of the society kind of echo that same message, right? And again, when you receive the same message from everywhere, it becomes very difficult not to believe it, right? And that's true, again, whether the message benefits you or whether it doesn't, right? So we mentioned a couple days ago, that Indigenous people receive lots of messages that, to be Indigenous is to be lazy and not as smart and no good and, probably addicted to drugs and blah, 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 blah. All of these negative stereotypes. And it's really hard not to believe those when you feel them and receive them from everywhere, right? So again, the social messages are powerful because people absorb them, right? And if you are disadvantaged by those messages, then it's going to be tough, right? It's going to be a rough existence. If we go back to movies for a second, we've said that movies are really important, right? They're agents of socialization. People enjoy them, they're entertained by them. We watch a lot of movies here in the West, particularly when we're in quarantine and we just turn on Netflix and do like movie after movie. But those are important agents of socialization because we watch so many of them. And when we find ones we like, do we not watch them multiple times? Yeah, of course we do, right? Everyone's got favorite movies that they've seen, 5, 10, 15, 20 times, whatever it is. Again, powerful agents of socialization when we watch them over and over. And they teach us things about all of this stuff, about what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman, what relationships are like, what love is like, how to be a hero. All of these things are kind of communicated to us in film. But have a look at this. If you look at the 25 highest grossing films worldwide, so the films that made the most money and therefore were seen by the most people, by the most eyes, all of them are directed by men. These are all stories directed by men, except for one woman co-director for Frozen, and all of those directors are white, except for one person of color for Furious 7. Right? Those are all stories directed by white men. Of the top 100 films worldwide, 99 are directed by men and 95 by white people. Right? So again, we're, the storytellers of Western culture, and even globally speaking, are men, right? And we've said that dominant groups get to enforce their prejudices throughout society, and film is one of the ways that happens, right? These directors are going to tell stories from their own perspective, right? They're going to tell stories that reflect their values and their culture's values, right? And so, again, it's maybe not surprising that white people, or at least the white male students in this study, maybe it's not surprising that they feel that they're right because that's what society tells them, right? Society tells them that they are right. Society tells them that their way of seeing the world is the right way to see it, right? Their socialization is teaching them that, their values are the correct ones, right? That their experience is more valid than that of others, right? And that's going to come through in media like this, right? One place you also see it showing up is in movies that are called, they have a what's called a white savior narrative. Has anyone ever heard of this? White savior narratives. Lots of movies like this. The one on the far right is a joke, obviously, but there's tons and tons of movies out there that are white savior narratives, and they're helpful in some ways and unhelpful in others. Okay, and so often they do tell historical stories, and they're stories that involve people of color, right? So that's good, right? Dances with Wolves here, I think it actually mentioned that in the Indigenous video we watched. It's actually a pretty good movie. Dances with Wolves was important in sort of telling the story of Indigenous people, when white people were starting to come into the Western United States, right? Glory here we see, I'm guessing this is Civil War, and we have some Black Americans fighting in the Civil War, right? Mississippi Burning, I don't know what that is about. Amistad has to do with the slave trade. Glory looks like it has to do with Abraham Lincoln and the emancipation of slaves in the United States in 1865. I don't know what this Matthew McConaughey movie is, Free State. I don't know what that is. Lots of these stories do are good because they teach us about history, right? Important parts of history that do involve people of color. But where they go wrong is, again, they often frame the story from a white perspective, or they put a white person in the role of the hero, right? And so often we have white savior narratives being built around a white character who rescues a bunch of people of color, right? And so the people of color are somehow incapable of saving themselves or doing what needs to be done. They need the white character to come in and do it, right? Has anyone seen The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise? Feudal Japan, right? Lots of samurais running around with swords, and yet somehow this white guy comes in and is the hero, right? Doesn't make a lot of sense. Again, it often creates a situation where the white person is the hero, right? The white person is the moral one. And it's the same issue with the Justice League, right? The Justice League is almost exclusively white, meaning that white people are the heroes, right? In any situation, white people are the heroes. And again, I know that's not what they're trying to communicate, but sometimes what we try to communicate and what we do are different things. And so here, this makes morality kind of the domain of the white person, right? Again, you'll often see that the white savior is often a male, and sometimes they're kind of out of place in their own society, and they find a place with foreigners or with minorities. But the other side of that is often a woman white savior, and you'll often see her kind of adopting a child of color and raising that child as their own, and there'll be all kinds of struggles, that go along with that. And sometimes it's the white savior goes somewhere else and sort of saves people of color. And again, I'll, just in case I'm ruining things for you, I'll ruin part of my childhood again as well. Has anyone seen this movie? 1984, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It's not the best. There's 4 Indiana Jones movies. This one is not the best. It's probably number 3. But it's a pretty heavy white savior narrative. So our hero here, Harrison Ford, Indiana Jones, his plane crash lands in India. He stumbles into this village full of people who he finds out that this evil palace has stolen their sacred stone and taken all their children with them as well. And so Indiana Jones ventures off to the palace, has a bunch of adventures, spoiler alert, recovers the sacred stone, frees the children, and they all come back to the village, and it's a big heroic ending at the end. But it's a perfect white savior narrative because these Indian villagers are completely powerless to help themselves. Literally, a white man falls from the sky because his plane crashes. He literally falls from the sky and comes in, and this one guy saves the village, saves the day, the whole thing, right? And again, in this movie, the non-white people who are the Indians, they're either the helpless villagers or they're the evil palace cult, right? That's all they are. There's really no room for anyone in between. And so again, it's not that the movie's not trying to be racist in any way, and in some ways it's definitely not, but it does have this kind of narrative, right, where he is the hero and his way of seeing things and doing things is correct, and he is the only one capable of rescuing these people. These people are seemingly incapable of doing anything for themselves, right? Even though he's literally just fallen out of the air with nothing but the clothes on his back. Um, yeah, so it's kind of interesting because again, these, you know, we get these messages through circulated through society, and the messages are basically telling us that white people are the best, right? They're usually the heroes. They're usually the moral, upstanding people. They're the center of most stories. They're the main character of most stories. And we know, if we look at the statistics, we know that white people have control of social institutions here in the West. If you look at government, education, business, the military, the criminal justice system, if you look at all of those, you'll see that white men are very heavily represented. And people of color, not so much. But what's interesting is, despite all of that, we have a smaller group here in Canada, but we do have them, a bigger group in the United States. We do have white supremacists, and these white supremacists actually feel the opposite. They feel that somehow they are the ones under attack. They feel that they're the ones who don't have power or who are losing power. And so, even though we have a lot of evidence that says that, yes, white people are the ones who are in power here, white supremacists don't really agree with that. And so that's kind of what we'll talk about next, is looking at these white supremacists and seeing what their deal is. But before we get into that, let's take a little break, stretch our legs, and then we'll come back and deal with white supremacists, okay? Okay, and we're back. So, again, my point here is that even though, yeah, it's it's a little contradictory in a way, right? Because I've said that a lot of the social messaging in Western culture, presents white people as the default group, the sort of group that has the most legitimate worldview and the most legitimate values. And if we look at society itself, we'll see that white people are really the ones who have institutional control: government, military, um, criminal justice, the media, education. All of these things are kind of within the control of white people. But we have a collection of people who don't seem to agree with this. We have these white supremacists, right? And so I wanted to. I have a short article for you to read here on what white supremacy kind of is, and so it'll talk about some of the sort of major groups that are white supremacists in the U.S., and some of those groups have members in Canada as well. What kind of things that white supremacists are kind of fighting for, and I think we can lead that into. There's a few things we could talk about. I'm not really sure what we'll talk about next week. We could talk about, yeah. Usually I talk about kind of white supremacy in the United States versus Black Americans, but in the last few weeks we've seen an increasing number of attacks on members of the Asian community, both here and in the U.S. And most of you probably heard there was a mass shooting in Atlanta a day or so ago that involved, I think, 8 or 9 Asian women. And so the spotlight now has been shone on anti-Asian racism as well. And so we could sort of transition into a few of those things, and I'm not really sure where we'll go next week, but maybe we'll start off with this. Yeah. Let's see. That'll be that. Maybe not next week, but maybe the week after that. What's that? I said it on. Oh, did I say the 1st of April?
Yeah, because last time when we asked the quiz,
Right.
you mentioned one on
Right.
Friday, and then one on 1st April.
1st April. Okay, that's what I was thinking. So not next Friday, but the Friday after. Okay, that's still good. I'm still good with that. So yeah, next quiz on the 1st of April. And that'll be the last one.
And like this Monday, you're going to give us our final grade.
Yes, I am. Yeah, because you'll. What's that? Almost done. Almost done. Okay, so I have this article for you here. Obviously, I'd like you to read it. I'm just going to see how long it is because I've forgotten. White supremacy and overview. Okay, it's a few pages. Okay, that's not bad. About 4 pages. Okay, so I'll turn you loose here to start reading this article. I have some questions on the board, or on the screen here, which you can see. Let's see. I'll give you about 15 minutes, and then we should be able to talk about it. Okay, so the article is in Microsoft Teams, of course, as it usually is, and yeah, 15 minutes. We'll talk about it. Okay, good people. I know you're still reading there, and that's okay. We're not going to finish this today, obviously. I did want to ask you this first question, though. What is one of the major causes of domestic terrorism and hate crimes in the U.S. today? Yeah, white supremacy and white supremacists, right? Which is kind of interesting because if you asked your average American, if you said, picture in your head a terrorist, what does a terrorist look like, do you think, to most Americans? Huh? Muslim, right? Probably a guy with a big beard, right? Maybe like a suicide vest strapped to him or something like that. Yeah, that's the sort of cultural stereotype for the Americans of what a terrorist looks like. But again, this is where you have to pay attention to the history and the data and the stats, because the statistics tell you that if you're in the US and you're being asked, what does a terrorist look like? You should be thinking about someone who looks like me, because more often than not, it is a white male who executes that terrorist attack, not a Muslim, right? And again, obviously the attacks on the World Trade Center from 9/11 had a big impact on the Americans in a lot of ways. But again, if you look at what's happening in the United States before 9/11 and after 9/11, you'll see that terrorism is generally something that white people do, not that Muslims do. And again, they point out in the article that the nightclub shooting in Orlando, which seems to have been committed by a self-proclaimed Muslim, but all the other ones are not. Prior to, I'm just going to show you this here. Prior to 9/11, the biggest terror attack in the United States happened in Oklahoma City. And I'll just show you some pictures here. I think it was 1993, if I remember correctly. And that's not the screen I want to show you. I want to show you this one here. Yeah. So this was the federal building, so a federal government building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And a white guy named Timothy McVeigh, who had a grievance against the government for another incident, which we won't go into, but he had a grievance against the government, and so he parked a U-Haul truck full of ammonia in front of the government building here. And Timothy McVeigh used to be in the military, and so he kind of knew how to wire and build explosives, and so he parked an entire U-Haul truck full of explosives in front of this building and pretty much took out half of it. Dozens of people killed, hundreds of people injured, and until 9/11, the worst terror attack in American history. But again, perpetrated by a white man, not a Muslim, not a Middle Eastern person, nothing like that, by a white person. And again, we had an act of terror yet again a couple days ago with the murder of those women in Atlanta, and again, committed by a white male again, right? And so again, we have this, the Americans have this idea, well, we in the West have this idea of what a terrorist looks like, but really the data suggests something else, right? The data says that it's not, terrorism is not something that Muslims do. Terrorism is something that white people do in the United States, and they do it to their own people, right? They do it to other Americans, even though there is this kind of stereotype and narrative that says something different. Oops. Here's my thing. So yeah, kind of surprising, right? Or maybe it's not surprising to you, but it is interesting that the stereotype is very different from very different from the reality, right? And again, we've talked about that a little bit before. The idea is that dominant groups get to be seen as dominant group members get to be seen as individuals. Minoritized group members get to be seen as one of the group, right? And so, again, if a Muslim commits, a terrorist act, he suddenly represents all Muslims, right? But if, Timothy McVeigh blows up the Oklahoma City Federal Building, he doesn't represent all white people. He's just a crazy guy, right? He's just got a mental illness of some sort, right? And you'll often see that happen where minoritized groups get to be seen as one of a group, whereas dominant group members are seen as individuals, right? And here it kind of works against minoritized groups because, again, Muslims, if they are involved in any sort of terror activity, people will judge the entire religion in that way, right? But if Timothy McVeigh, or whatever this guy's name was who was shooting people in Atlanta a couple of days ago, people won't say, oh, well, I guess all white people are like that, right? We will search for a reason for his crime, right? Mental illness, radicalization, whatever, right? We'll find some other kind of justification. It will never be, well, this is what white people do, I guess. That won't be the explanation. Anyway, we'll deal with that on Monday because that's all the time we have. Tomorrow you don't have any class, so enjoy yourselves. I will be envious of you, or maybe not if you've got lots of work to do. Don't forget, papers due at midnight tomorrow, so don't forget to submit that on Microsoft Teams through the assignments function. And that's all I have for you. So pack it up, have a nice Friday, have a nice weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. Okay.